This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. Each week, we bring you timely interviews with life science experts focused on trending topics, frequently asked questions, and industry best practices. This week, we are pleased to welcome Felicia Ford-Rice, Senior Director, Regulatory and Access at Parexel. Welcome, Felicia.
Thank you very much, Stacey. Happy to be here.
Great to have you back again. You did a podcast early on, like late last year, and it took us a little while to catch back up with you, but I'm glad to have you.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here to discuss data integrity today.
Yes, data integrity and some new guidance that's being drafted by the World Health Organization. So our listeners are familiar with regulated industries. They work in them every day, as do you and I. Whether it's pharma, biotech, or medical devices, we all understand that, we're subject to regulations under GxP guidelines. And those regulations we are closely monitored by various regulatory agencies. And those agencies, of course, as we're all familiar with, provide updates from time to time to guidance documents in response to observations in the field, as well as feedback from the industry. And so we're going to talk about one of those guidance documents today. The World Health Organization, as I mentioned, is finalizing their draft guideline for data integrity document. And that's going to replace the WHO guidance on good data and record management practices. And I'm hoping to kick us off, Felicia, you can provide a brief overview of the guidance, highlighting the major changes that you see here.
Thank you, Stacey. So yes, the World Health Organization, or WHO, has actually produced 4 guidelines, and they all deal with data. 2 of them were focused on good data and record management practices, which Stacey just mentioned. They were released in 2015 and 2016. And then last August, WHO released their draft guideline on data integrity. And then they released just in June, so less than a year later, a new version. And this is during the COVID-19 pandemic that this was released. So the guidance documents are targeted to the pharmaceutical industry. This includes drugs, biologics, as well as medical device manufacturers. And they are meant to help industry prevent data integrity lapses or failures, because this is critical to ensuring the health and well-being of patients across the world. So I want to talk to you about a few key changes between 2019 and 2020 versions of this guideline. So in general, there's several sections that emphasize expectations for adhering to data integrity principles during the entire life cycle of the data. It's not anything new, but it was not in the previous version. And then interestingly, there was a section previously that was entitled Data Integrity that was removed, although some of the concepts were incorporated into other sections. I guess They felt it was a bit redundant to have this section when the purpose of the entire guide is data integrity. So just to give you a quick refresher, data integrity principles are codified by ALCOA Plus, which means attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, accurate, and then the plus is complete, consistent, enduring, as well as available. So, of course, as you can imagine, there's a glossary to define all the terms. A few of the existing definitions were eliminated because they were not necessary, and then they added a few definitions such as certified true copy, data, and then they made significant additions to clarify the definition of metadata. This is probably in response to comments they received from industry that people wanted to have a better understanding of what the expectations were. Skipping ahead to Section 4, which is data governance, they actually introduced a few new key concepts, which are not new to anyone in pharma, but they wanted to make sure that data integrity guidance incorporated the same language around incidents and deviation management. They introduced cybersecurity, which is a key threat to many systems today. As we migrate to higher technologies, you may be subject to cybersecurity attacks, and also put more information in regarding how to build databases and collection, data review, randomization and blinded data, which is more pertinent to GCP, as well as tracking and trending of data integrity lapses. There's also a section called Management Review. It has two new statements that ask management to ensure that they are providing appropriate oversight, quality metrics, and management understanding of data integrity regulatory requirements. So it's very key and important that it's not just the individuals who are executing, but also the managerial levels that have responsibilities. They specify in Section 7 outsourcing contracted data and document retention activities to make sure the data is integral during the transfer, storage, restoration, or encryption of data. So, of course, our industry is heavily reliant on trusted partners who are vendors and suppliers and service providers, and they also need to adhere to data integrity principles. With respect to Section 8 on training, they talk about clarifying that data integrity training is not limited to one function. In many cases, there's a misperception that it's a quality responsibility, but the guideline makes it clear that it applies to those who interact with GxP data and who perform GxP activities. They also talk specifically to individuals who are responsible for using computerized systems for interpreting and reporting data, and where risk assessments have shown that this is required. So they provide information on that. Also, there is a key Section 9, data and data transfer. They added the term data transfer to the section heading because this is a particular concern. There have been findings by the regulatory authorities during inspections that there are some cases where data are transferred between, say, a vendor or service provider and the sponsor or the manufacturer. And there has been issues with ensuring the integrity of the data. So they want to make sure that that is also accurately and contemporaneously recorded when you are in the manufacturing suite as related to critical process parameters. So there are 3 new sections, and these 3 new sections within data and data transfer talk about the requirement for programs and methods to also meet Alcoa Plus principles. They talk about how data transfers should be subject to change control. And lastly, that data transfers should have audit trails and be validated. In Section 11, computerized systems, there are some new statements, and they're talking there about how to validate the design, implement and maintaining controls, how to mitigate and eliminate unauthorized manipulations of the data. And a lot of that is geared towards some of the findings that you may be familiar with around chromatographic and other laboratory data. So they wanted to make sure it was very clearly spelled out in the guidelines. So there are new statements saying that it's unacceptable to have shared login or generic user access, meaning one username, one password that is used by multiple individuals.
Right.
Requiring that there's a justification and documentation of any controls that a third-party software that you implement might be utilizing. So if you have a system that collects data but is unable to generate an audit trail, and so you are utilizing a third-party software to provide that audit trail, that there's a justification as to why that's taken place, and then you have appropriate documentation of those controls. Making sure that all the data that is GxP can be retrieved and read throughout the entire retention period, and that there's electronic backup and periodic, this is interesting, a periodic backup and restoration and if there are any discrepancies in the data after it's restored, that they're recommending an investigation to take place. So that's pretty much through the guidance. There is a reference section, and previously they just had the brief title of the reference. Now they have the full citation of the reference, and it has a corresponding URL, so you can easily access those particular references. And then they added a few citations that were not there previously. So they added a citation for the WHO guidance from 2016, the quality risk management guidance, as well as the good data and record management practices guidance. They had a reference to ICQ-9 from 2005. So it's a little aged, but it's still used. And they also had a reference for the MHRA GxP data integrity guidance from 2018. Now, it is interesting that there are two guidances that they did not list, but I'm hopeful that they'll be corrected during the review process. It is still a draft document. They do not have a reference to the previous version, the 2019 version of the good data and record managed practice. And they do not have a reference to the US FDA 2018 data integrity guidance, although they do have a reference to the 2016 guideline.
Sure. Well, Felicia, it sounds a lot. I mean, it sounds like they've made several changes, but most of them seem to be for clarification purposes or to provide further explanation of the expectations around this document. What I do note is that it seems like they are also offering, some guidance or an emphasis on really understanding who's responsible, right? Knowing how the responsibility lies in your organization and who is taking charge and making things happen. I find, and as we mentioned, this is a draft document at the moment, so I imagine they are still taking feedback from industry professionals if they notice things like missing references. You better call in on that one or email in on that one. But the WHO draft guideline describes data integrity. One of the things that I noted in there is it describes data integrity as the degree to which data are complete, consistent, accurate, trustworthy, and reliable, which seems to line up with the ALCOA principles a bit. In your mind, how does this guidance compare to other data integrity guidelines that we are familiar with, such as FDA, PICS, and the UK's MHRA, which they do reference in their document?
Yes, thank you, Stacey. So the guidelines are very closely aligned. You mentioned some of the key points where they describe the data integrity definition, but in all of the guidelines, no matter if it's an industry association, if it's a regulatory authority or some other global authority such as PICS or ICH, they all agree 100% that ALCOA Plus principles are the governing principles for data integrity. And that is the standard that they will hold you to. They may use different terminology to explain it, but they are all consistent. To just briefly walk through the sequence, the very first GMP data integrity guideline came out in 2015 from MHRA. And that was shortly followed by the WHO GxP data integrity guideline. So the difference there was the MHRA was initially focused on GMP. That's where they saw the bulk of the issues during inspections. But then the WHO recognized that it was GxP. And then across 2016, 2017, and 2018, there were reiterations of those guidance documents as well as new guidance documents from PICS. And then in 2018, the MHRA and the FDA, PDA, as well as PICS finalized guidelines. So it was very interesting that as a whole, all of these organizations, which if you think about it, they're either impacted by or populated by those individuals who work in industry and have a vested interest in ensuring a very smooth and quick and effective, yet safe drug development process, are all aligned in their thinking around data integrity. And they're just looking for ways that they can reach industry. They can reach not only those people who are in pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies, but also looking at those trusted vendors and suppliers and contractors to make sure they're completely aligned so that we can ensure the integrity of the data and get those medicines out to the patients as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and we definitely appreciate that, especially in this time where we are trying to move so quickly with, new vaccines for this pandemic we're in, right? So we want to make sure the guidelines are still being adhered to, even as we really pick up the pace. So, it's excellent that they're offering this support, as are all the regulatory agencies, and then really understanding the meaning behind the guidances is also important. Felicia, across the industry, and you did mention this early on, we have seen an increase in the number of warning letters and observations made when, regulatory agents are out doing inspections. And particularly, we have seen many of these around data integrity issues. And who seems to be really, when you look at this document, really attributing much of that error, much of those warnings and observations to human error. How do you think this updated guidance can really solve for that particular piece of the puzzle?
Absolutely. So it is a little tricky. We have to look at industry as not a monolithic industry. You have new companies starting. You have individuals who are new to a regulated environment. And in many cases, they are not as well versed as they should be on issues of data integrity. So from the perspective of regulators, why do we need to have data that's integral? Well, they're relying on the accuracy and completeness of these records because they cannot allow products to be on the market without knowing that the information that they're using is accurate. They're making regulatory decisions related to the identity of the product, its strength, the purity, the safety. It depends on valid data and information being documented and submitted in the marketing applications. When they look at data integrity issues, they look at how it may have been impactful to the product quality or the product safety, because of course that's going to have impact on patient safety. Right. And then lastly, they're making decisions to approve or withhold approval of a marketing application based on accurate and complete data. So the worst case is you have a product that is going to be helpful to patients. It is safe and it's effective. And because of the way the data was collected or recorded and reported, it is not trusted. So the World Health Organization, as well as global health authorities, recognize that there's a human element to data integrity. And this is addressed by this guideline in 3 key ways. So they want to emphasize the need for policy and procedural controls so that everyone who is in a regulated role knows the expectations for data integrity. Number 2, they want for there to be a quality culture that encourages transparency in both reporting and investigating failures. Failures are not a bad thing. It's only bad if you allow the failure to stand, you do not investigate it, determine what the root cause, and correct it. And then thirdly, they are emphasizing proactively conducting data integrity risk assessments and implementing controls. That is to prevent any of those lapses from occurring. So it's important not only to identify that a data integrity failure occurred, but to understand why, and develop ways to prevent future failures to drive process improvement and compliance.
And root cause analysis, which you just alluded to, is one of those things that we see come up in most of the regulatory documents, right? And having a proper control. So it seems like they're a lot of what they're saying is very much in alignment with our expectations in the industry already, based on the other regulations and guidance documents. Is that true?
Absolutely consistent. So it is stated several times throughout the guidance documents that This is to be used as a guide alongside existing regulations. As you know, regulations can be a little dry, and if you're not as familiar with them and if you haven't been used to implementing them, you may not understand how to properly interpret them. So the guidance documents are to give you a little bit more granularity so that you have a better example of how you're supposed to conduct your work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in this document, we also did hear, and you mentioned it, them talk about training, which in my mind, when you have human error, oftentimes, it comes down to improper training, or as you mentioned, processes and protocols haven't been documented clearly, or they're not available. The SOPs aren't available readily to staff. So I think training is an important piece. Mm-hmm. And if training programs are to be implemented, what are best practices for knowledge transfer and retention in your mind? And I ask this with a global pandemic underway, because what impact will distance or remote learning have on this process? And I want to get your thoughts on that.
I can talk all day on this. You may have to stop me. So one of my pet peeves is the implementation of solely, it's not bad, it's used properly, but read and understand training. Sure. So if you only implement read and understand training, it limits the learning process because there's no one to reach out to ask questions and to better understand. So best training is one that can be interactive, where you're going to be discussing the key concepts of data integrity principles, or ALCOA Plus, and it should be applied to the particular work responsibilities that person has, whether that is manufacturing or in the laboratory, in the clinical setting, or in a safety setting. There's nothing worse than being provided with an example that has nothing to do with what you do. For example, if you talk about data integrity that has to do with building automobiles, it doesn't help me translate how I'm going to use that in my regulated environment. So best practices, every employee should know the expectation for their actions within the workplace. And this includes, but it's not limited to, certainly, knowing why data integrity is important to regulators, their company, physicians, and patients. They need to have a full understanding of that. Right. Also, they need to be, the best training identifies all the company policies and procedures that describe the requirements for data integrity and document control so that you can go to those as a ready reference. You should have an awareness of the health authority data integrity regulatory requirements. You should understand good documentation practices and ALCOA Plus principles and how that applies to your daily activities. And then you should also have training that helps those employees ensure that their behavior and their activities always reflect that they are being honest and their data is trustworthy. Something that's really important, and I've said it before, but acknowledging that mistakes happen. We're human. The expectations and process for escalating to management for anything that happens regarding data integrity or documentation discrepancies. And this is when it's known, when you absolutely are sure, but it's also if there's a valid reason to suspect it. So that's a new nuance that needs to be emphasized in the best training. Also contributing to the management review process to ensure that metrics are clearly communicated and that negative trends are swiftly acted upon. So this is typically done on a quarterly basis in pharmaceutical companies, and it's making sure you're doing your part as an employee to contribute the correct metrics. And then you need to know, or your personnel need to know, how do you report data integrity and other compliance issues? What if I've been instructed to do something that in the conduct of my work responsibilities that's not consistent with policies, procedures, and regulators? Who do I go to when the person who's instructing me to do these things is the person I would report to? So the best training also involves letting others know how you can communicate and report anonymously where it's warranted. And then with respect to distance or remote learning, we're all staring into the camera these days. So it's something we're really getting used to. And as you know, it's not advisable at this point in time to gather in large numbers for traditional face-to-face training. But there are manufacturing facilities, laboratories, clinical trial sites that remain open. And that's to make sure all of those medicines that patients need are being manufactured, tested, and then released. And then in those environments, there is an ability to do some social distancing, use a facial mask to allow for small group training. However, just because you're not face-to-face doesn't mean it can't be interactive. So during remote learning, there should be an emphasis on interaction. So there should not be a talking head like I'm doing right now. There should be a dialogue, introducing queries to the audience or introducing role play or small group activities where people can go in perhaps a chat room. I know Zoom offers that feature where you could separate into a separate room. To actively engage the participants and let them not only talk to the instructor, but also with one another. An ability for questions to be posed by the audience. There's nothing worse than to hear something and you have this burning question and you can't ask the question. So you can extend the Q&A period. You can allow for a voice question or chat or both. So that way the audience feels that I'm paying attention, I'm getting information, and then if I need to request additional information, I can get that from the instructor and from the other attendees. They should provide situational examples and participative exercises of what to do and what is not acceptable to do. That is reflective of the type of work that they perform on a daily basis. And the last thing I'll say is it's important to note that data integrity training is not one and done. Right. You know, whether that's conducted in person or remotely. So it's important to make sure that all the participants in training have access to aid memoirs and references, that there are periodic follow-ups by their supervisors, because what gets followed up gets done. So if you take a training and no one ever follows up and asks you questions about it, it's very easy to forget and not implement it. And this will help to ensure understanding and compliance of this important concept.
Thanks, Felicia. I mean, I definitely agree that interactive training is the best, especially where you can have so many nuances within the pharmaceutical industry or the medical device industry. And it is interesting to me how many trainings are moving to the remote and keeping that interactive piece. And I wonder, I don't know how feasible it is, but I know people do learn best when they can apply it directly to their daily jobs. Mm-hmm. And as there are still groups of folks working in the manufacturing facilities themselves, almost having a sky cam or something, that can observe what maybe your colleagues are doing, even if you are remote, might be a nice add-on at this point in time, when folks can't come together in larger groups for training. So hopefully they are taking advantage of all these technologies to continue on with that training, because as you said, it is not like, one and done. Learn this today, and we expect you to follow this rule, in perpetuity. You need to build on those basic building blocks and continue to add skills over time. But I'm gonna stop there because we could talk about training all day, effective training and not effective training. But I want to continue on with some other aspects of this particular WHO document. And an important note in this document suggests that organizations should move away from systems, which include a combination of old-fashioned paper documents and digital documentation. And we are seeing that in a lot of organizations still, that they have some hybrid model of documentation going on. And it seems like a very time-consuming and costly effort to wholly make this transition. And during COVID-19 pandemic, do you see this as an attainable goal for most companies or organizations?
Yes, so that's a very interesting question, Stacey. Let me try to address it this way. So I believe the WHO guidance recognizes that within our industry, there's a variety of systems where GxP data are generated, recorded, processed, retained. Some of it's paper-based, some of it completely electronic, and some are a combination of the two or hybrid.
Right.
All of which require data integrity controls. No matter which system you're using, it requires data integrity controls. So you may have organizations that have a lot of resources where they're relatively new, they're nimble, they're agile. And in those cases, the electronic systems are more common than paper documentation, which you call old-fashioned, but I still use paper too.
Well, I mean, just for, our listeners, I'm saying old-fashioned, but I mean, you have legacy systems in place that might just be the way you have to do things for the time being, right? So
Absolutely. And so when you work for a pharmaceutical company or a biotech company, you walk into the environment infrastructure that exists, and you must learn how to adhere to the data integrity principles, no matter what the environment is.
Absolutely.
And so this is also a reflection of the investment in technology that allows for real-time monitoring of your processes, recording, and transfer of your data. So the industry wants to develop these novel therapeutics, vaccines, et cetera, as quickly as possible. Look at where we are with COVID-19. We're moving as fast as possible. And if you have electronic systems, that aids that. So the WHO guideline recognizes in one of the sections on data transfer the expected controls for electronic systems, and then Section 10 talks about good documentation practices, and they talk about, in that, the control for the paper records. There is an example in the guidance document, it's titled Contemporaneous, and they talk about the use of a hybrid system. And the way they set it up is to say, I could have a sample that I need to weigh in order to go into the production suite or into a reagent mix for testing. And I have a balance that I'm going to use to do that, but the balance does not have a printer and it's not connected to a computerized system for data capture. So I put my sample on the balance, it shows me a digital display. The only way to capture that information is manually in real time, or it's going to be lost.
Right.
So I think you're absolutely right that the conversion from paper-based systems or hybrid systems to electronic systems, they can be very time consuming and very costly because we're typically not looking at just one manufacturing suite or one laboratory. Most companies want to have a harmonized set of equipment, et cetera. So it could be very expensive to purchase new equipment or upgrade or update your existing equipment. And so what we're expecting now, just because of COVID-19, is that industry will be taking a risk-based approach, and they'll look at data integrity lapse trends that they see to determine if the appropriate controls are in place and that they address those immediately, especially where there are hybrid systems involved. However, replacement of legacy systems may not be the priority for industry at this particular time.
Yeah, and that definitely makes sense in my mind, and I'm sure in our listeners' minds too. And I'm glad you mentioned risk-based because I had a question about that. So in line with the current approach in GxP, this guideline does recommend a documented risk-based approach, of course, as most of the regulatory guidances do these days, over the entire life cycle of the data, considering data criticality. So basically prioritizing, right, based on risk. Do you anticipate any critical changes to the data integrity risk assessment, either process or record keeping under this new guidance?
Okay, so as you know, in our industry, we're heavily regulated, and every decision that we take is based on assessing the risk.
Right.
So it's common during drug development and commercialization. It drives our decision making and determines what path is going to be taking. This is par for the course, to coin a phrase. implementing data integrity risk assessments is just another means of emphasizing how important it is to identify and mitigate risk to collecting and reporting trustworthy data that are used not only by the regulators, but are also used by our own companies to make decisions in the best interest of our patients. So I don't see that it is a difference. The best risk assessments are objective. It's an evaluation of data integrity controls. That includes looking at any existing governance documents, personnel training, which we've discussed, and what methods are currently in place to detect, report, and remediate and prevent data integrity lapses. So there is a section within the guideline that talks about quality risk management and the frequency that they should take place. But I think it is more to ensure that data integrity risk assessments really permeates so that people are using it on a daily basis, that our risk assessments are not only about a failure in a manufacturing process or a failure in a laboratory process or a failure in a clinical process, but also could be a failure in our documentation of our GxP activities process. And so it's very important to ensure that that is something that is ingrained in every personnel throughout the management structure as well, so that it takes place, it's taken seriously, and that it becomes a normal, routine part of our activities.
Yeah, so the expectations then with this guidance document and probably all of the others is that they're just trying to keep this risk-based assessment concept front of mind, right? And
Absolutely.
reminding us constantly that, like, this is where you should be focused. Like,
absolutely. And it becomes routine, and you will continue to do it without having to be prompted to do it.
And that, again, all of this makes total sense. I just wanted to make sure that we understand the differences, if there are any, between this and many of the other guidances out there. So, Felicia, many GxP organizations are also relying on outsourced activities. And I know you mentioned this when you were talking about data integrity and who's responsible for that. If they are relying on outsourced activities, off-the-shelf software solutions to manage the quality of their products, what role do these vendors play in data integrity efforts under the WHO guidance? And what is the expectation for outsourcing under this new guidance?
That's a great question. So, as you just stated, you can't do everything on your own as a pharmaceutical company or a biotech company.
Absolutely.
You have to rely on your core business reason, and that is to produce drugs of quality. So, of course, we use vendors. We purchase API. We may purchase components and parts and all, equipment. All of those things. Our vendors and contract service providers are expected to be trusted partners and adhere to the same data integrity principles as the sponsors and manufacturers that rely on them. However, sponsors and manufacturers are expected to conduct vendor qualification and ongoing surveillance inspections and audits for GxP compliance, and that certainly includes looking at the capacity of that particular vendor to be prone to data integrity lapses. It doesn't necessarily mean you will never use them again, but you certainly want to be aware of it so that, once again, you can do the risk assessment, you can conduct an investigation, determine the root cause, and remediate that before it has any impact on your product. So with respect to the new draft guideline, it uses judiciously the terms contract giver and contract acceptor throughout the guidance to clarify the responsibilities of each. And there's also a specific section, Section 7 for outsourcing. It talks about the expectations for the company, who's the contract giver, as well as the vendor or contract service provider, who's the contract acceptor, to ensure that data integrity requirements are in writing, that they are verified during audits of the supplier, whether it's a qualification or ongoing routine surveillance, and that any activity that is GxP cannot be outsourced to a third party without prior approval of the contract giver. So you know exactly who your supply chain is, you know who your service providers are, you can track their regulatory risk history, and that you can work very closely with them to resolve any issues because you know who they are and you know what their history is.
Absolutely. So it sounds like then, if you're partnering with vendors to provide certain services or software products, et cetera, they then can't turn around and subcontract that out to someone else without written approval under this guidance, which I think is a fantastic thing. And because ultimately, at the end of the day, when something goes wrong and there is a breach in the data integrity, the buck stops with the organization, right? Who's the contract giver, I guess. And so they need to make sure that there are certain protocols and processes in place that really help them to maintain that high quality data integrity that they're expecting.
Absolutely. You said that perfectly.
Well, good. And I think a lot of this is pretty much in line with if you've been around the industry for a long time, with the expectations that we already have based on the other regulations and guidances, and just this whole, risk-based model that we have and quality assurance that we have been shifting to, over time anyway. So all of this sounds to me like it's spot on. If there are issues like what you've noticed where they're missing maybe references or additional clarification can be offered, I'm sure we'll see some comments made back to WHO on that information. But hopefully they're able to get this. Do you know what the timeline is for them at this moment to finalize this documentation and release it back to the industry?
Yes, I have it. It's off to the left, so I can't look at the date right now, but they did close comments last week.
They did? Okay.
They were due on the 15th.
Gotcha.
And so they are looking to move pretty quickly forward with this one.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate you taking so much time today, Felicia, to go over this new draft guidance with us and really help us understand how it stacks up against all of the other guidances and industry expectations that we currently have. In closing, I just want to see if you have any advice or action items that you'd like to leave our listeners with.
Yes. So thank you for that, Stacey. So data integrity observations continue to be reported during health authority inspections. We know that health authorities have not been on site unless there is a significant issue and they are doing data reviews remotely. But when they resume, there's a little bit of a fear that because they have not routinely been coming to the sponsors' manufacturing sites and clinics and laboratories, that there may have been ample time for data integrity lapses to occur and not be detected. So that remains to be seen.
Okay.
Data integrity observations can be significantly impactful to industry, but they also prevent safe and effective therapies from reaching patients. And I think that's the worst tragedy of them all.
Absolutely.
Think of all the experienced personnel who put in years of schooling and they put forth their wonderful efforts to bring drugs to market, and then it stopped because of a data integrity lapse. So it's imperative as an industry that we utilize data integrity guidelines, such as the WHO guidelines. We adhere to the regulatory requirements to build and maintain that trust, not only with the regulators, but with the patients. A well-trained and informed workforce is the best way to prevent data integrity lapses. If you know better, you do better.
Absolutely. And
remember, everyone in the company is responsible for making sure they're aware, they understand data integrity, that they adhere to the Alcoa Plus principles, and know why it's important to protect patient safety and drug quality, and that they report known and suspected data integrity lapses to management for them to take action. And finally, they execute effective data integrity corrective actions and preventive actions where they're warranted. And then finally, hold themselves and those around them accountable for the culture of quality. So right now, we're in a precarious time where personal protective equipment is not only used in our manufacturing suites, pharmaceutical laboratories, and clinical trial sites, but they're required for activities of daily living throughout the world.
Right.
I'm just hoping that everyone will stay safe and we'll get through this together.
I agree. Thank you so much for that. Those are wonderful goals for all organizations, not just during this pandemic, but, always, just to deliver the highest quality, most effective treatments to the patients in the, in the best time frame that they can. And of course, that all comes down to data integrity and making sure that everybody's well-versed in all of the pieces of it. Well, I thank you so much for your time today, Felicia. It's been such a pleasure to have you with us again. And I appreciate the explanations and really walking us through this guidance document. So thank you.
Thank you, Stacey. It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I also want to say thank you to our producer, Ben Kitchen, and the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. Lastly, a big thank you to you, our listeners. We wouldn't be where we are without you, and we do appreciate you for sure. If you have topic requests or guest suggestions, we'd love to hear from you on that. You can shoot us a quick email. If you enjoyed this episode, we ask you to subscribe to it or to this series on your podcast player of choice and share it with your friends, colleagues, and online networks. For today's show notes and information on this podcast, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. And we'll be back again next week with another great interview. Until then, stay healthy and safe.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.